think we're ready to go.
Well, we just got a quorum then.
Good evening. I'd like to call the meeting to order and welcome you to the regular meeting of the Milwaukie Planning Commission. Agendas and additional copies of staff reports are available on the city website at www.milwaukieoregon.gov. You may locate them by navigating to the community calendar where tonight's meeting page is posted. If you have not reviewed the agenda, please do so. It contains important information about the process. The city of Milwaukie respectfully acknowledges that our community is located on the ancestral homeland of the Clackamas people. In 1855, the surviving members of the Clackamas signed the Willamette Valley Treaty, also known as the Calapooya-Tetra Treaty, with the federal government in good faith. We offer our respect and gratitude to the indigenous people of this land. I'd like to take one moment to, I'd like to take a moment of silence to recognize the native people of this area.
This, whatever they're seeing up there is what's on the. Yep. Okay.
Thank you. Moving on to the approval of the minutes from the May 24th, 2022 meeting. Does anyone have any corrections to make? Hearing none, I will entertain a motion to approve the minutes as presented.
I would like to make a motion to approve May 24, 2022 and June 28, 2022 as written.
Second the motion.
Point of order, so far I've only asked for corrections to May 24th.
I'd like to make a motion to approve May 24, 2022 as written.
Second the motion.
All right, we have a motion to approve and a second. Are there, everybody votes, everybody who wishes to vote in favor, please say aye and raise your hand.
Aye.
Any nays? Passes unanimously. Next on the agenda is approval of the minutes from the June 28, 2022 meeting. Does anyone have any corrections to make to these minutes? Hearing none, I'll entertain a motion to approve.
Move to approve the motion or the minutes for the June 28, 2022 meeting as written.
I'll second the motion.
Okay, we have a motion to approve in a second. All those in favor say aye and raise your hand.
Aye.
Aye. Is anyone else there other than the four of us?
No.
No. Okay, so passes unanimously. Thank you. Are there any informational items from staff?
They're not this time.
Okay, thank you. So this is an opportunity for members of the audience to comment on items not on tonight's agenda. Does anyone wish to comment on an item that is not on tonight's agenda?
Brett, is anybody there?
No one is here.
No one's there. No one's no virtual guests.
That is correct.
Okay. Then I will jump ahead. At this point of the agenda, the Planning Commission will act as the Community Involvement Advisory Committee. I now ask staff to provide any updates.
We've been having a couple conversations over the course of the meetings about kind of the next steps with the CIAC. And I am working on pulling together something for that. I didn't want to have the full discussion tonight because Commissioner Losfeld isn't here tonight, and I know this is an important conversation to her, so I'm hoping to hold off until August 23rd. But I did want you all to know, I know that Commissioner Massey is planning on going to the NDA meeting, the general meeting, quarterly meeting in September.
September 15th.
September 15th, and kind of reporting back to us on that. And in the meantime, we'll have another conversation about how we see the portion of the meeting looking moving forward.
Yeah, and I think the thing that we want to address at the next meeting is I was originally planning to go really in a listening mode more than anything else, but I think that based on that sort of sidebar conversation between you and I and Laura is that we may want to do more to sort of fill out the agenda for the annual meeting. So I just need to have whatever direction that, that the commission wants me to take to the 15th meeting. Okay.
Okay. And I think that's it, unless there's anything else to add.
Okay. Do CIAC members have any items to report? Okay, and then again, no members of the audience are present, correct?
That's correct. There's no one else present.
Okay. Then let's move into the work session items for downtown design review. The work session item is a discussion of code amendments related to downtown design review, and Senior Planner Brett Kelper will present information about the code amendments for discussion. Brett, take it away.
All right, let me adjust the camera here a little bit, at least momentarily. So good evening, Acting Chair Edge, Commissioners. Brett Kelver, Senior Planner with the City Planning Department, and I am going to start a conversation with you about some proposed amendments to our downtown design review code. And let me share my screen.
I'm just going to interject by saying how excited I am to be here to talk about this tonight. This has been many years in the making, so I'm really happy to be here tonight. I know Brett spent a lot of time on it, with a lot of folks on DLC working on this stuff.
All right. Okay, yes, good evening. We're going to talk about downtown design review and the sections of the code that relates to. This is a project that we've been working on for a long time, and what we were hoping to do tonight, this is the first of what we've scheduled as 2 work sessions to dive back into the material. What we wanted to do tonight was just kind of refamiliarize you all with those parts of the code that we're looking at, and talk a little bit about some of the main things that we're looking to adjust and change with it. We've got a few questions, some specific things that we want to either call out and or discuss with you, and then see kind of where we're at the end about whether there's some additional information or other questions you have that will help our conversation on the 23rd. So just an overview of what we've been doing. This is, I don't believe Commissioner Hemer was still on the DLC when we started this part of it, but this is an effort that started about 5.5 or so years ago in 2016, initially as an effort to refresh the images that are in our downtown design guidelines booklet, which is effectively a kind of a separate document that's outside the code. And there was a sense among the DLC members at the time that some of the images, you can see a couple of them I've got from the current document, are not representing Milwaukie per se. This is Waterfront Park in Portland and Washington Park in Portland, and there are images from, they're illustrative, but they're from Colorado and other places. And so the DLC members thought it would be maybe more helpful if we had some images that were a little more representative of Milwaukie, or at least the scale of things that we might see in Milwaukie. So that's how this effort began. And we had a lot of conversations with the DLC, had multiple meetings over the initial kind of 2-year part of that. And along the way, and I believe Chair Loosefelt was involved in the DLC at this time, and the more the group looked at that downtown design guidelines document, the more they thought, why are we just talking about images? We need to actually freshen up some of the language that's in here. Some of the descriptions of kind of Milwaukee's goals or vision for itself seemed a little out of date. And it's true, this document was adopted in the early 2000s. So the focus kind of shifted and became larger, I guess, as a recognition that there was a need to maybe take a harder look at not only the overall design guidelines document, but to look as well at how it fit with the code. And so that's the next stage that we got into, beginning in kind of in early April. We engaged with an architecture firm, Sarah Architects, and a kind of a code specialist, Elizabeth Decker with Jet Planning, to take a harder look at the code. And part of what the group had done before is illustrated in this kind of graphic that's at the bottom of the slide. We developed a matrix, and we pulled out there were 7 design elements that are in section 19.508. That's where the downtown design standards live in the code. They're represented on the left in the alternating shades of gray. And then we took each of the 5 categories of the design guidelines. There's Milwaukie character, pedestrian emphasis, architecture, lighting, and signs, and started trying to kind of cross each of them to see, does this particular guideline match somehow with with that particular design standard or design element. So that was the nature of a lot of those meetings that we had with the group and what we got into with the architecture firm. And by the end of that period in late 2019, we decided we need to move forward with kind of a wholesale code amendment of these couple different sections that I'll point out here that relate to this. And so that's where we've kind of, coinciding with the beginning of the pandemic, finally got into what we're hoping is the last stage of this, where we've been looking very carefully at these different code sections. And the DLC has spent a lot of time, a lot of discussions, a lot of meetings, and I believe Commissioner Edge was kind of the Planning Commission's liaison to some of those meetings, so he can probably remember some of that as well. And they've kind of looked at a lot of the details that are involved with the particular standards and have kind of decided that it's time to move this forward. And what we want to try to talk to you about a little bit in these next couple work sessions are more of the bigger picture of that. So with that in mind, let me just kind of recap what parts of the code we're talking about. There are essentially 3 sections in the code that deal with downtown development and downtown design. One of them is section 19.304. That's where the actual development standards are. So what are kind of intended to be some of the things that relate to the physical development, like what's the maximum height, what kind of setbacks are there, what are parking requirements, that kind of thing. Then the actual design piece is in 19.508. That's where you get into more of these things that are kind of more architectural or actually have to do with design. So how does the facade look? If the building's on a corner, how does the corner function? What is the main entrance like? Is there weather protection? That kind of thing. And then, just as an aside, the section that's kind of makes it go is 19.907. That's actually what tells you whether you need to do downtown design or not. But then the third element is that separate downtown design guidelines document that just has some of these more aspirational visions and things that are a little more out there. It's not standards, it's kind of general ideas, and that's those different sections that I talk about: the character, pedestrian emphasis, architecture, et cetera. So that's the universe that we're working in here. Along these lines, just an example, if you're doing a new building that's either non-residential, so it's intended to be commercial, or mixed use, like many of the buildings that have been reviewed more recently, like the Axle Tree building, which is shown here, which is a combination of some commercial use on the ground floor and then residential use up above. There are 2 ways you can go through review for this. One of them is if you meet all the standards that are in 19.508, then you can go through type 2 review. And that is a decision that's made by the planning manager, so in this case by Laura. It does involve sending public notice to people within 300 feet. There's an opportunity to comment, but as you know from all your deliberations, we're talking about standards. So unless you think that staff and Laura have missed or misrepresented or interpreted the standard, there's really not a lot to say about it. It's supposed to be kind of a black and white, clear and objective kind of process that happens to have public review and comment. Or if you're not meeting all the standards in 508, then you go through this type 3 review, the discretionary review, that involves the DLC having an initial hearing and making a recommendation to you, the Planning Commission, and you are the decision maker. You're trying to decide if the approval criteria have been met, which include both the standards where applicable, the purpose statement of the standards, and the gray area that we've gotten into as we've looked at this more carefully, which is which of those guidelines in the downtown design guidelines document relate. So right now for new buildings in the downtown, there's two tracks, type 2 or type 3. Interestingly, for any multifamily building that tries to happen in the downtown mixed use zone, there are actually more options because we have a separate section of code, 19.505.3, that has specific standards for multifamily buildings anywhere in the city. So if you're trying to be a multifamily building downtown and you can meet all of the standards in 19.505.3 that have nothing to do specifically with downtown, you can go through type 1 review. So almost just like a building permit type of review. If you're not meeting all of those multifamily standards, but you can meet the guidelines for multifamily development in general in 505.3, then you can use type 2 review. You can also use type 2 review if you decide, I'd actually like to engage with the downtown design standards in 508 for my multifamily building. So there are kind of two options there for type 2 review. Or if that multifamily building is not able to meet either the guidelines of 505.3 or the standards of 508, then it comes to you through the type 3 review process. And an example here was the Dogwood Station building that you saw recently. So currently multifamily buildings downtown have several options, and that raised some questions for the DLC given all the work that's been put into trying to come up with a coherent fabric of design for downtown buildings. Why should multifamily buildings that happen to be downtown have the option not to address those, was a question that came up. So kind of in summary, some of the issues that the DLC identified as being problems and reasons to look at changing this have to do with kind of, as an example, again, this matrix that I mentioned before, where there are a bunch of guidelines in that current downtown design guidelines document that don't have any corresponding standard in 508. The green in these boxes is supposed to show where there was a sense that there was some correlation. So for example, if you weren't meeting all the standards for a building facade in 19.508, and now you're supposed to look at the guidelines document, and if we're in the Milwaukie character section, the first element there is reinforce the sense of place. And so the group thought, well, I guess that it seems like there are aspects of a building facade that have to do with what our sense of place is. So we're going to color that green. We'll say, if you couldn't meet the building facade standards, then we think you would need to show that you are somehow addressing the sense of place portion of the guidelines. All of this, if you can imagine, as you look at some of these other guideline groupings, is very discretionary, very gray, and seem to be not very helpful both for applicants who are supposed to try to decide when they're putting their package together which of these things they should address, staff as we're reviewing it, and the DLC and you as reviewers. It's like there are 3 or 4 different parties that are all kind of trying to decide how to interpret this document. And so the group thought, this needs to be tighter. We need to have, if we have clear standards in 508, we need to have purpose or guidelines that are very clearly connected so that there's a much tighter relationship here. So there was also recognition that there are a few of what were called development standards in 19.304 that actually have to do more with the design. One example, and something that that moved, interestingly, from one part of the code to the other, between the axle tree project, which was went above the base maximum height, and that triggered what at the time was a development standard to say, if you go above the base height of 3 stories, then you need to step back those upper floors at least 6 feet. At the time, that was a development standard, so if you couldn't meet it, you actually had to get a variance, which is what the axle tree project did. That felt pretty uncomfortable for a number of reasons. And so actually between that project and the other ones that have come since, that particular standard moved into 19.508. So the idea was then, if you didn't meet that standard, now you didn't have to get a variance. Now you just needed to talk about that particular design element and the purpose that was attached to it. So you were able to, in what was already a discretionary review where you're already talking to the Planning Commission, trying to make your case that the purpose and these different guidelines are met, you could talk about it that way instead of having to address a technical variance. So the idea was there were some of those development standards that needed to just move into the design part of the code because they have more to do with that. So what the DLC is recommending and what is represented in the different, the versions of the code that were attached to the packet, 304, 508, and 907, they've suggested revising all of them including, or with the idea of trying to better align the design guidelines with the design standards, so that's just clear and everything is actually contained in the code sections instead of having to look at a separate document that already doesn't correlate well to what's in the code. So the suggestion is to bring everything into clear parts of the code to get rid of the downtown design guidelines document. And some things that we wanted to point out, I guess, are involved with this are, again, we noted in 508 there are currently 7 design elements for which there are standards. Between bringing some things in from 304 and trying to expand and make those better connections between some current guidelines or things that the DLC thought were important with respect to design that didn't have standards, the proposal is to effectively double the number of elements, which on the one hand you might think will make things a little more complicated, but the idea is it actually makes it clearer because you give clear topic areas for the applicant and then for staff and decision makers to address, and it should make it clear for everyone to make the case. So the other suggestion, as I alluded to earlier, is that where we're talking about multifamily only buildings downtown, the group is recommending that we eliminate that option to simply address the general multifamily standards in 505.3 and to say, look, if you're going to be any new building downtown, you need to be focusing on 508. Part of the trick there is, as I noted before, for other new buildings right now, the only 2 tracks are type 2 and type 3. Neither of those are really considered clear and objective processes. And the issue with housing only projects is they do have to have a track. We're required to give them a I meet it or I don't kind of clear and objective track. So what this would mean is if we say, if you're a multifamily only project downtown, we're going to say, if you meet the standards for design in 508, we'll give you a type 1 option instead of type 2. If you don't, then you go to type 3. And that this, our suggestion from the group is that you consider that for any new building. Part of the discomfort of some members of the DLC with having only a type 1 option, type 1 or type 3, is that with type 1, there's no public notice. It's simply kind of an administrative decision. And there was some sense, understandably, that for something as significant as a new building downtown, people at least needed to have some information to know that it was coming. And so our suggestion is that we, in conjunction with establishing a type 1 track, certainly for multifamily projects, and again, we're going to recommend for any new building, is that you allow a type 1 option, but simply require public notice, not with any opportunity for comment, but just to let people know that it's happening. Because as you know from other cases that you've had, there can be a lot of confusion when there's a comment opportunity but no real clear opportunity to make a difference. And in this case, the idea was, look, city, you've laid out black and white standards for my new building. I've shown that I'm meeting those. There's really no way you should be denying my project. If you want to let people know it's happening, fine. Let's have that type 1 option. So that's a big recommendation as part of this other package. And then along the way, we're also trying to take the opportunity to clean some things up. We're trying to update the graphics that are in the code and do a couple other housekeeping things. So I don't know if I should pause for a moment to see if people have questions about the universe we're trying to lay out of the project and the different parts of the code. So I'll stop for a second and ask.
So Brett, you made the reference that I may not have been around in 2016, but I may have been around in 2003 when we started the whole redoing deal. And I guess my comment is that I've always argued that what is Milwaukie character? Do we say that it, and I'm not picking on any particular building, is it Libby's, is it Foxy's, right? Or is it Axletree or Main Street Village, right? What is Milwaukie character? And so that has always been a conundrum. And so I like the idea of having clear and concise objectives. I think once we get into this type 2 review list and type 1 review list, that I may have some direct concerns. But one thing, I think that this might be a great place, instead of the type 1 with public notice, which doesn't actually give the public a chance to respond, but maybe we could require to meet with the historic NDA after pre-application. And then that way, that allows a public notice to go out, at least with historic NDA, allow them to have an opportunity to discuss with the developer, builder, whoever it may be, whoever handed in that pre-application, to be able to have changes ahead of time before it gets so far down the road that you can't make any changes at all.
So you're saying, your suggestion is to have that required meeting when we have like received a pre-application conference request, like, and before that pre-app happens, or what was your timing on it?
I guess, so the way that I look at it is that somebody comes in with a pre-application with an idea, right? They may not have penciled everything out yet. They are in this idea stage. But I think before it goes to application, when they have a set plan and everything's already kind of penciled out and figured out.
So before they submit the actual application?
Yeah, so that they can at least talk to a group to allow them to influence the way that looks. Right, that's kind of what, I mean, really what you are saying is that, well, we're going to eliminate DLC's role in downtown design review. I know that's not the intention, but, or at least reduce the amount of eyes on the project, maybe. But at least it gives a chance for a group to review what is coming in so that they can provide some input. Whether or not it sticks is another question, right? But at least it makes that neighborhood, right, feel that they were involved in the process.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah.
Do you understand what I mean by that?
Yeah. Creating.
Instead of this type 1 with, you just throw out a type 1 and say, here's public notice that they're going to build this, and they've done all the standards so you don't get any input. It'd be much better to have them have input before that application gets put in.
Yeah, I see. So basically adding a requirement that almost like a requirement for submittal be that even for any level of review that, and maybe we define like new building or really substantial addition or modification to existing building has to go to a meeting with the NDA before submittal, kind of as a requirement.
I think that would be a wonderful idea instead of doing the public notice of type 1.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's very reasonable. And I appreciate Commissioner Hemer bringing that up. I've always advocated, for the NDAs, for the other groups that I'm involved in the unincorporated part of the county, next door. I've always advocated for getting the community involved in like the pre-application stage of developments and allowing comments to come in for the pre-application stage. This is kind of like the next best thing, and given that there's no opportunity to affect the trajectory of it after it's already been submitted, because again it passes, it's objective review. It either measures out, it either clears the specs or it doesn't, and so this is a great compromise, I think, to being able to at least give the community an opportunity to influence what actually comes in that application is really huge, and I would really appreciate seeing that as a requirement to do before you come in with a type 1 application in these cases downtown specifically.
Chair, this is Robert. May I have the floor for a moment?
You may.
So I too really like the idea of getting NDAs involved. Okay, I think I've said that in these meetings over and over and over again. Because we always have a better outcome when that occurs. But at the same time, this gets back to that question about, can you require a developer to meet with an NDA? So that's a question I have for the staff. Can you require that?
I believe that you can require that, because I know that there are jurisdictions that do that.
Okay.
My question, and this is a question that we'll have to ask of Justin, he's not here tonight, obviously, is whether or not we could require that as part of a type 1 development. I don't know the answer to that, so I would want to confirm that, because it kind of sets up a expectation that the developer may do something or not do something based on the conversation that they're having. And if the developer does not do any of those things, then I think we're setting up a bit of an expectation that may not be met. So I would want to balance that, not setting expectations too high, but trying, to your point, getting more involvement with the NDAs. And I'm not exactly sure what that perfect balance is.
And maybe just following on that, I think another question that I would have was, what if a developer reaches out to the NDA and they say, well, our next agenda is full. You can be on the one after that. And, meanwhile, a developer is trying to, secure financing and move forward. So I think, would a requirement be that you have to meet, or would the requirement be the trying to meet, trying to schedule a meeting?
If I could comment to that, Commissioner Sherman. So from pre-application to application is a 6-month to 8-month process, probably in general anyways, right? From the time that you meet with somebody from pre-application to the time that they go to application is a longer period, especially on a 5 to 7-story building downtown.
Well, I think it really kind of depends on how a particular developer handles it. I mean, someone who is familiar with Milwaukee's code, who may do a lot of work on the front end of kind of pulling their project together, and it may be very late in their process that they talk to us in a pre-app conference to say, hey, we just want to check and make sure that we're not going to be surprised by anything. I think it could vary. I mean, it could, in some cases, it could be actually many months from pre-app to submittal time if someone's kind of very early in their process of trying to pull something together. But in other cases, it could be, just a month or two if they're really near the end of their.
Right, and so the reason why I'm comfortable with this is because we're only talking about the downtown mixed-use zone only, right? We are not talking about any zone outside of that. This zone is very limited in scope. We know that it is the public playground of Milwaukie. And so I never should use that word. I dislike the fact that there could be no to little public comment put together towards a place where we all come to visit and play and want to feel comfortable in. And so I just think that the NDA seems to be a compromise, right, to that type 1 situation. I mean, you're bending the rules anyways to put public notice to type 1 as it is anyways. It just seems to me if you just put out public notice saying, hey, a building's going to be built here, well, what have you accomplished?
I guess I think I think the spirit of your concern and the suggestion is well taken. Now, this is similar to discussions that the DLC had as well. And I think one thing that I tried to emphasize in those conversations was that in a way, when you're trying to establish what are going to be clear and objective standards, that's the important time to nail down what you think is good design or not. Because once you do that, I think an applicant could say, why am I having a conversation with the neighborhood? I've got the property. You've told me the rules. I'm going to meet those rules. Why do I need to be influenced? If you find out that I own the property, and you maybe want to talk to me about what I might be doing, that's kind of outside the land use approval process. Once we get to, I'm telling you now as a developer that here's how I'm responding to your standards, check, 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 I meet them all. It's just a little apples and oranges in terms of the type of conversation.
I guess my point is that they could have all the design standards put into place, but they could go to the NDA and they could say, well, look, we're going to do orange, black, and blue as our colors. And the NDA could be like, can we do blue and green and yellow? Right? And so they still meet those design standards, but there are those discretionary things, right, that give a feel and a look to a building, right, that may not match with downtown. So those are the discussions that could be had, because they can walk in the room and say, I have type 1, you can't tell me what to do, but can we talk about the color, or which statue of art do you like, or which screening do you like better?
Chair,
Those are the conversations.
Chair Edge, if I may. I think that is what some communities do. You know, you look at some communities in Southern California, and as part of their process, they have color palettes. They have other things like that. To go back to your opening comments, Commissioner Hemer, you know, what is the character of Milwaukie? Is it Libby's? Is it this? Is it that? You know, we don't have that. And so then I guess in some ways it becomes not really a clear and objective space to be like, we like pink today and we want yellow tomorrow. I think if we wanted to, you know, work to think through color palettes, I bet a lot of people would have pretty strong feelings about that. So I guess I worry in that sense, as Brett was saying, you know, if we've outlined what we think are clear and objective standards, and if they meet those clear and objective standards, you know, it feels like we're just asking somebody to jump through a hoop. And I understand and value the intent of that. I really do. But it just goes into the expectation setting of a developer and even community. It seems like you're just, you know, setting it up for tension.
Chair, if I may. Brett, clear this up for me, because I thought when you were giving your presentation, correct me if I'm wrong, that the proposal was to eliminate the type 1 reviews for downtown. Is that not true?
No, the proposal is to establish for multifamily only buildings. Let's talk about a couple of these. So for multifamily only buildings, which already have each of the options, 1, 2, or 3, it was just basically eliminate the 2 and say, look, either do type 1 if you meet the design standards of 508, or like other buildings, go to type 3. For other buildings like Axle Tree or Coho Point, the idea was right now it's only type 2 or type 3. So it was kind of for new buildings, eliminate type 2, the suggestion is, and create a type 1 track if you meet the standards. So have 1 and 3. Types 1 and type 3. So not to eliminate the type 1, but especially for multifamily buildings, making sure we maintain a type 1 track. There has to be a type 1 track.
Okay, just one follow-up. So I'd like the staff's, you know, based on the Hemer model that we just heard, I'd like to understand, well, you know, it's good enough descriptor as any. What's the reaction to adding another review, the NDA, the DLC, the Planning Commission? What I get concerned when we have so many moving parts. Is that a concern on the staff's part at all?
Well, sure, yeah. I think that, to be clear, I'm pretty sure, maybe Vera can correct me if she knows from code memory, but for a Coho Point type of building, so mixed use, let's say, type of building, type 2, or if it's able to go through type 2 review, I believe that the code doesn't require a DLC meeting. There's no DLC involvement. DLC just gets involved the same kind of way the Planning Commission does at type 3 review. But yeah, I do think that in general, we're aware of how many steps there might be for someone to work through the process.
We're not proposing to change that for type 3, which is how it works today.
Right. For type 3 review, you do, for any type 3 application, you're supposed to go through a pre-application conference. But for none of our applications for any type of land use approval, you know, we're not a community like others do that actually require an NDA meeting. Some communities require that you meet with the neighborhood before, kind of almost like a pre-app requirement. And we haven't done that, which isn't to say we couldn't do it for some things. But.
Thank you.
So are there other
I
questions?
think that's a really good idea. I'd try to, if I may, just get in here really quick. What I'd want to do is it should either be part of like the pre-application, conference, or it should be, a before the application is submitted, like Commissioner Hamer is suggesting. And, just somewhere in there, we should require that the NDA gets engaged about, buildings downtown that are going through a type 1 approval. And then, for anything that's type 2 or type 3 and remains so, those notifications, are already in place and would remain. But we're specifically talking about this new kind of type 1 review, which makes perfect sense because, we need to support, we need to align with the legislation, or, the VLCD rules around needed housing. We need to offer a 100-day clear and objective track. There's really no reason to require that to be type 2, like staff is saying, because there's no discretion involved in that. It's, does it meet the dimensions and does it meet the color palette, whatever. That's all clear and objective. And so it makes sense to get that engagement with the community before. But also, we need to check with Justin about this, is to be cognizant of, the fact that the whole point of the needed housing statutes is to allow a very rapid, timeline for housing projects, to go through the approval pipeline. And so when they are clear and objective and there's really no discretion that we can do anything about it, we don't want to delay that anyway, and to be like Commissioner Sherman was saying, I believe, where, we don't have any time on our agenda, so we're going to punt you to next month, and we're not meeting next month now, and so we're going to punt you to next month. Whatever, it ends up having the effect of, delaying the clock, even though they haven't started the clock because they're required to have that meeting first. So we need to be really cognizant of that and make sure that we're not, usurping, the state law around, how we deal with needed housing applications. But then, again, just to remind everyone, keep in mind, this is pretty much a narrow subset of the applications that are going to come in, even for downtown. We're still looking at, mixed use commercial applications still would be, at this point are type 2, or type 3 if the guidelines, are used. So, it gets discretionary at that point. So anyway, not a lot is really changing. We just need to be able to support, these residential cases where, you can meet all of the standards. So we need to have good standards. And that's part of what we're doing here and what the DLC has been working on for a long time is getting really good standards, in place and reworking all of that. And so, and I was involved in that. Chair Roosevelt was involved in that as chair of the DLC, for quite a while. And so, we put a lot of effort into making good standards and also good guidelines to pair with those standards. But that's the part we have to get right, because once we do that, then, things that meet that criteria are going to be approved, because that's what the point is to give property owners certainty over what they can do when there's a needed housing project, that they're seeking to invest in. So anyway, this is, I'm glad with the direction we're going with this. I really hope we can get something like what Commissioner Hamer's proposing for NDA engagement, early in the process, but we have to find the right balance. We have to strike the right balance with all the different moving parts and everything. So I don't know. I know I cut someone off. I think, was that Commissioner Sherman?
Thanks, Commissioner Edge. I think I'd be interested in seeing more. I also would want to be very careful about that balance. And, I think thinking about things like not only it being an NDA regular meeting, but also potentially a special meeting or a land use and transportation committee meeting. I think we need to think about what the flexibility would be there, because I worry about, creating undue delays. But it is an interesting thing to kind of think about, and I'd be interested to kind of hear more, especially with council's advice as well, in terms of what we may or may not be able to require. I would also perhaps caution us to think about how creating this set of rules for downtown becomes a precedent for the rest of the city to also make their case for why they are also unique and special in some way and should be afforded similar privileges. So I think that's something that we should be thoughtful of as we're deliberating on this.
In my opinion, that is not a horrible idea. just so that you know. I think the precedent is wonderful.
So are there other questions at the moment, or shall I dive back into there? I think we're at this point in my presentation where there were a few of these issues that we've actually started to touch on a little bit that I was just going to point out as ones that I'd be curious to at least get a little bit of feedback or take your temperature on a little bit. So let me share again. All right, so some of the items that we thought we'd bring up, one we've touched on a little bit, and that was about the suggestion to kind of push multifamily buildings in the direction of having to address the downtown standards. You know, we took a little bit of a look at a comparison of the multifamily standards and guidelines in 505.3 against 508. And there are some differences. They're not radically different, but they also reflect, I think, a little bit of the nature of the different spaces. Like downtown by its nature is a little more constrained. It is more dense. You're not necessarily going to have kind of a sprawling campus of spread out multifamily buildings with a lawn and pool and all that. It's going to be more compact. And so some things like specific landscaping requirements, that kind of thing, seem not really necessary. They're just not going to be applicable in downtown. Whereas there are a few aspects of more specific design about what is the facade like, what kinds of transitions are there, that did seem like worth considering. I'm not sure that the sense was that it was terrible to not have multifamily buildings addressing 508, but it was highly preferable to have them going through the same kind of review scheme as any other building. And I guess depending on how the commission and ultimately the city council feel about that question, it seemed to us that it made sense if you do decide to push multifamily buildings in that direction, either type 1 or type 3, meet the standards or go through discretionary review, that what is the reason not to allow other buildings, mixed use or other non-residential buildings, to also go through simply type 1 if they meet the standards, or type 3 if it's more discretionary. It seems like a little bit of an undue process burden for those buildings.
So just to be clear, if I can, Brett, because I think Chair Edge, you had said that maybe you thought that it would go, these commercial mixed-use buildings would still continue to go through a type 2 or a type 3, but I think that what the DLC had been talking about was to go through a type 1 or type 3. I just wanted to be sure that that was clear.
Yeah, that's a recommendation.
Yeah, and I guess what I should have said was the word could, because you know, it's obviously not settled until until council adopts whatever amendments they're going to adopt. But yeah, that's absolutely correct. And if this is the time for comment on this, then I'd be happy to offer my comment. But if Brett, you want to go through some more slides, then.
No, I think actually, I think it'd probably be more efficient just to pause here if there are some more thoughts or comments that you all want to share about either of these.
I like the direction of this. Of treating things downtown similarly based on whether or not they comply with the standards. And I think that we need to be looking, when we're talking about the resources that are getting committed by the city to, doing a type 2 review and perhaps an appeal of that type 2 review, to the planning commission, I think that we need to be cognizant again of what can actually be accomplished by that process when we're looking at an application that really is complying with clear and objective standards. If you really are complying with clear and objective standards, I don't know why it wouldn't be a type 1, no matter what kind of use it is, unless obviously it's a conditional use, those have, a specific type of review. But, if you are a primary use on in a zone that you can meet the clear and objective standards, then I don't know why we would make it more complicated. So that's my take on that. I think that's a good direction to go. I think we need to focus, our, really in-depth reviews, on things where we can make a difference, where we really have a chance to affect, the outcome of the, of the project under review.
Chair, if I may ask a question?
Please.
So I have two, I don't want to get in the weeds, but the thought just came, so what happens if you're going for a bonus? A residential and green building that we write into the code, is that type 1 review or is that type 3?
Well, I think in so much as you're able to demonstrate that your project qualifies for the bonuses as the code says you are, I think they're often going to be, they already are pretty non-discretionary. I mean, if you meet a certain green building certification standard, boom, you are qualified for one extra.
Right, and then with the setbacks that the code puts in there, right?
Right.
Okay, so now I am looking at page 21 of our program, which is page 6.1, page 7. And you have this consider removing from type 1 review list and consider removing from type 2 review list. To where? Where does that go? When you say consider removing from type 1 and type 2, does that mean that that goes automatically into type 3? Or that automatically goes into type 1?
Do you want to, can you give an example of one?
Modification, under consider removing from type 2 review list, modification of an off-street parking area that results in a reduction in parking spaces and or an increase in paved area, which is a type 2, it says consider removing from type 2.
Right.
Where would that go?
Yeah, so for the items, you may notice that the items that are suggested for removal from both of those lists, type 1 and type 2, are largely, they're not exactly the same, but they're all the same family. They're about changes to a parking area, changes in landscaping, changes, something like that. And the suggestion was they would just go away and not need any review. And the idea is, what standards are we reviewing them against? Like some of the other items on that list, say, for example, if you're changing a facade of building, or you're changing windows in a facade, but you're not decreasing the percentage of windows. Well, we have design standards related to windows. So your project can, there's still something applicable to review it against, because we have a windows element, but we don't have a parking design standard. So the question is, why am I?
Wait.
Yeah.
We have a parking standard.
We have a whole chapter about off-street parking that applies throughout the whole city.
So, but then this says modification to an off-street parking, which I'm assuming in my language, off-street parking means on-site parking.
Correct.
Right. And so are you saying that we don't need to consider a modification of off-street parking anymore?
Not through the downtown design review process. So I guess an example.
But does that become a type 3? Then that goes straight to the planning commission?
You wouldn't find your activity in that list, so you wouldn't need downtown design review for modifying a parking area. So I guess an example might be, we're talking about surface parking lots.
Just to clarify, Brett,
Yeah.
Sorry, just to jump in. I think what I'm hearing is that there's still a parking modification process that applies citywide, that if you wanted to modify your parking and reduce it below the, create a reduction that causes a reduction in parking spaces, you would have to go through the process that's defined in the parking chapter, not in the downtown design review chapter.
Thank you.
Which
Yeah.
that creates a type 3 review.
Well, I think the parking modification is
Whatever kind of review is defined in that chapter for parking.
in chapter 600. So right, to be clear, where it's talking about parking quantity or changing a parking lot in a way that affects some of the standards, let's say for perimeter landscaping or something like that, that are in chapter 600, you have to deal with whatever chapter 600 tells you you're doing about the parking area. But where it comes to downtown design, we have no downtown design standards for parking, just like we don't for a fence.
Thank you. No. So what you're saying is that we're removing these things from type 1 to type 2 because they exist in another chapter somewhere in the code.
Yes, even though they may not all need some kind of land use review, because that's what a downtown design review application is. It's a type of land use application. So we have a section in Chapter 500 that deals with accessory structures like fences, and it's got standards for industrial zones and residential zones. I don't think it has any standards specifically for downtown zones. So that's a case where there is no, there's not necessarily a clear standard for a fence in the downtown. So why would I make someone go through a review for design when I have no standards for it? There's no approval criteria. I'm asking you as an applicant to give me an application about something that I don't have any standards for. Or I'd be asking you to give me a downtown design review application related to changing your parking area, but in 508, there's nothing about parking design for downtown. You find parking design in Chapter 600, and like Commissioner Edge was saying, if you're changing the number or affecting that parking area in a way that conflicts with 600, 600 will tell you what to do and what process you might need.
So help me out here. If I come in with my application and I have let's say anywhere in the city, and I don't meet my 0.75 spaces per building, or 0.5, whatever it is for multifamily. I can't remember. We keep reducing it and reducing it and reducing it. And I say, well, I want a 0.25, right? No matter where I'm at in the city, what does that trigger?
You're going to have to probably make a parking modification application and kind of.
A type 2 or a type 3?
I think it's type 2. Yeah.
And
Go ahead.
with the new rulemaking that's happening, we're not going to be allowed to mandate or require parking in the future, starting in March of 2023. So for about 80% of the city, we will not have parking mandates as per required by the state. Just to clarify that point.
All right, so in other words, I'm about ready to argue a moot point, is what I understand.
Well, and I think the things you're seeing on listed on page 7, going back to what Brett was saying, is this is kind of code cleanup. This is a list of things that have no standards, and so they're simply being eliminated because maybe there's a standard somewhere else in the code, or maybe with the reference to the fences, there's no standard whatsoever.
No standard in the DMU zone.
Correct.
Right, no standard in the DMU zone because they live somewhere else in the code. I'm fine with that. I'm okay. I guess my question was that it says, consider moving from type 1 and type 2. I was just wondering, where did they go? If they live somewhere else in the code that has a standard that no matter what zone you're in, you have to apply to that, then I'm okay with that.
Right. And I guess I would just note that for certain things like fences, for example, I don't know that there are any standards anywhere else. And part of the point was, and we don't have any standards for downtown fences in the downtown section of the code. So I guess the question would be whether the commission and the city council want to establish some standards for fences. In that case, we would expand 508 a little bit more, and then we'd want to keep that item on the list. But if we don't have standards for you, there's no point in going through a review.
I know that the majority of the people that are watching in this audience and that maybe be sitting in this room, that we're all going to have automatic Uber drivers driving us around in the next 10 years, or we're all going to believe that a bus and a light rail system is going to get us to everywhere we need to go. But I do want to stress that downtown parking, especially not only for the residents, but for the business, has been a hot topic issue, let's see, since, 1950. And so I think that it does, but I guess the state can tell us what to do anyway, so it may be a moot point. But I think it does create a huge amount of conflict, and I would much rather see a parking standard put into the downtown mixed use than I would anywhere else inside the city.
And when you say parking standard, what do you mean?
I'm sorry, so many spots per building, and that if somebody comes into a modification for that, then it goes straight to a type 3.
So, it sounds like conceptually.
Or a minimum parking standard.
Yeah, or whatever it is, yeah, however we set it up.
But yeah, I guess I would suggest that if you wanted to do something like that, the place to tinker would be the parking chapter, not necessarily the downtown chapter, because I think what the items in those lists of type 1 and type 2 review are at least supposed to be about is let's talk about the design of your fence. Is it going to be chain link? Is it going to be wood? Is it painted? You know, that kind of thing. And the recognition is we don't have any standards for that. So why are we requiring people to go through review? And the same with parking, in that beyond what 600 says, chapter 600, about, hey, you need to have an 8-foot wide perimeter of landscaping between the parking area and the right of way, let's say. That you're going to do that if you're doing surface parking. But beyond that, what special downtown design for parking do we have? We don't have any standards, which isn't to say we couldn't create some, but there aren't any.
Right. My point is that I'd much rather see a standard with the downtown mixed use zone than I would anywhere else throughout the city.
Okay.
And especially because of the overriding conflict to make our place workable, livable, and sustainable.
It's just that I hear you talking about number and not design.
I'm sorry, I was throwing that out as my example because that's the piece of the code that I can kind of remember.
Yeah.
And so when we talk about reduction of that would be the number, right? A reduction of that. So I'd much rather see in the downtown mixed use zone have a standard for parking in it than I would eliminate and push it off into 600 or whatever to allow it to be just a type 2.
Okay.
Do you understand what I mean?
I think I do. Yeah.
And I may be alone on this. Probably I am alone. I'm sure that Chair Edge will and Chair Sherman will tell me that we'll all have automatic roller skates that will be riding around that will get us to where we're going to go in 10 years. But like I said, it makes me nervous.
Well, in all practicality, Commissioner Hamer, we can require parking if we institute, like parking meters or parking permit program or something like that. And so the state gives us options. The easy option is like Laura was saying, is not requiring parking at all in designated areas. But in any event, the reality is that we can have standards around parking. If parking is getting built, even if we can't require it, if parking is getting built, we can define standards for design standards for what that parking looks like. And if there's good cause for having specific design standards about how parking downtown needs to be different from parking in the rest of the city, this is the place to put it. And then also, but does that mean that we, necessarily need to have a type 2 review to discuss, how, the kind of lighting in the parking, or whatever other, specific design, elements of the proposed parking downtown, is being modified or whatever from the standards? I don't know. I mean, that's the kind of stuff. We're really talking about design stuff. I know that the language here says number of spaces, but we're really focusing on design elements with this. And so, do we need a type 2 or a type 3 review when certain design elements downtown are being modified when we really don't even have any standards or guidelines around those anyway? And so that's really the focus of this list, or these two lists in the back. And, I'm kind of the mind that I'd be happy to see these go away because, I think that staff is making a very, good case for a practical case for, why we don't need these specific reviews extra for modifications to projects proposed in downtown versus the rest of the city. So I'd be okay with seeing these go away. As proposed, but I know that if, certainly like you're saying, this would be the place to keep some of these around if we thought that was necessary for any standards that do belong in the downtown design standards specifically that relate to some of these things that, again, might have a citywide, chapter or whatever, but if there's something really specific to downtown design, this is where it goes, I think. Right, Brett?
Yes. Yeah. Whether it's 508 or just stick with the example of fences for a second. If you thought, look, actually, we do want to have a little bit of control over what kind of fencing goes up downtown, then it might actually be the 304 would be a place to put it, almost like a building height kind of thing. You'd say, look, fences, you can have them downtown. They can be no more than X feet tall, and they can be made of these different kinds of things. Or you could say, they can be made of whatever, just not these kinds of things, and make it a standard. And I guess if you thought that there might be enough variety or a need to actually have some kind of discretion for that, to say like, well, my fence type is kind of special. I kind of need somebody to look at it and it doesn't quite fit with your black and white, list. But then maybe I guess we need to pull it into 508 since now we are talking about design. But yeah, that would be the example. If we can think of some standards that you'd like to have executed with some of these things that relate to design, then now would be a good time to come up with them and try to find a home for them in one of these sections, 304 or 508, I think, if that makes sense.
I have no argument with any of the design except for parking. Just so that you know.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm comfortable with, the parking capacity issues remaining in 600. I don't, I'm trying to envision, design, elements unique to downtown. I can't come up with any off the top of my head. I didn't really think about fences until you started talking, and I would be willing to listen to that as a design element that might be unique to downtown. In other words, for instance, we might be okay with chain link fences out in the residential areas, but not in downtown. That's an example. Maybe not a good one, but one that kind of jumps to my mind that might be design related.
We started on multifamily and got ourselves into the applicability section, but I think generally I'm also in agreement on fine with the list. If folks wanted to have a conversation on some of the things like fences, I'm a huge fan of English cottage garden fences. I think Milwaukie would be a great place if we just required them on every parcel.
A plant does not.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, only hollyhocks and roses. So, if that's something staff wants to work on, I'd be all right with that. But to me, it's also not a big issue. On the multifamily buildings, just to pull us back to this, I think I feel comfortable with what both DLC and staff are recommending in terms of treating residential only buildings the same as non-residential and mixed use buildings. I think that makes a lot of sense.
Okay, I'm going to try to advance the slide. I'm not sure if I have full control
Have more
over this machine. I do.
Open up for others.
Well, this is an item that I inadvertently did not include in the staff report, but it's one that I want to just put on your radar and something we might talk about at the next meeting. This is one recommendation or that the DLC was interested in getting some feedback from the Planning Commission on, and this is exactly about that step back issue. So the idea is you're a building that is using bonuses to go above the base maximum height. Our current code says when you do that, along that entire frontage, you need to step the building back at those upper levels. So let's say 3 stories is the base max, you're going up to 5 because of your green building and it's residential. The 4th and 5th floors are supposed to be 6 feet back along the entire way. And one of the things that came up in conversation, for example, I think especially with the Axle Tree project, was that represented a loss of some floor space. You could get a few more units in there, provides more housing for people if you didn't have to do that and didn't have to go through some kind of a variance or special discretionary process. So the options that the DLC wanted to put out were, one, well, we could just keep it the way that it is and say, once you go above the base maximum, step it back 6 feet, or allow a little bit of flexibility. And my numbering ended up being wacky. I've got 1 and 1, but the second option was supposed to be a partial step back. So the idea is, look, for 50% of that frontage where you've gone above the base, you need at least a 6-foot step back for 50% of it. And so we're not having a bunch of in and out ruffling on the building. Those step back areas need to be at least 20 feet wide. So kind of a significant step back. And the idea is to just try to reduce a little bit of the impact of the extra mass. So this is something that you may just want to think about. Again, I didn't discuss it in the staff report, but this is something that's represented in the draft code. I think in part of 508, it's kind of highlighted as like option for Planning Commission feedback, option 1 or option 2. And so this is the kind of thing that, the DLC, again, did spend a lot of time kind of looking at the detail of the numbers and all that kind of thing. And and on most everything kind of felt pretty solid about what they're recommending. And frankly, a lot of it is not changing. This is not a radical rewrite and redesign of the entire design in terms of the numbers of how many stories or, what should it be, 6-foot step back? In most cases, it's just kind of rearranging things. And where there was an example like the axle tree one, a recognition like, hey, should we look at this? That was kind of an issue for that one project. And it sounds like other projects might have that issue. Can we propose something like this option? So something I guess I'd throw out for consideration, be interested to see what the group thinks about it now or, in 2 weeks when we talk to you again.
Chair, if I may. So I don't know, many of you may realize that I just turned 50, and so my old man river card is coming out on me. And I'll never forget in 2003 when we just started this discussion with the public that it was only 3-story height buildings allowed in downtown Milwaukee, and everybody freaked out about 5. Then we got to 7 with the bonus. Everybody freaked out about 2 more extra stories because it's just going to dominate the skyline. And it was a huge public discussion, probably back in 2014? Is that about right? That we had a whole series of meetings about this. And the compromise was that 6-foot step back. So I would like it to see a little bit more public engagement, even though that I am not against it. It does not mean that everybody may or may not be for it. So maybe a question on Engage Milwaukie, since we have that wonderful system out there to maybe ask the public this question, since it was a major topic of discussion some 7 years ago. And like I said, it's my old man river coming out and the old memories coming out and the whole 9 yards, but just my suggestion.
Okay, thank you.
Good idea.
Okay, I just have a couple more, and I know I want to make sure you guys have time for your other item here. So I feel like we've gotten some helpful feedback. I just point out a couple of things that I almost would put into the housekeeping area. One, the top point, eliminate review for actions with no corresponding standards. That's kind of what we were just talking about. So, and this graphic on the right-hand side was a sample from the list. I just highlighted from, for example, the type 1 list, some of the things we had talked about removing just because it didn't seem like there were standards at present. Another item that also wasn't mentioned in the staff report, one that we were looking at, you just went through this extensive process to update the bulk of the residential zones, the moderate density zone. And I'm not as up on all the details as Vera and Laura are, but like one thing that stood out was, there's been, in some respects, there were these townhouse rules, and the townhouse density, even in the moderate density zone, is now 25 units per acre. Right, and I'm not sure what the background is, if it's like a state requirement or something like that. But we realized as we were looking at this that the currently downtown, which is supposed to be more dense than a lot of our moderate density areas, we were stuck at a minimum density for townhouses of 10. And so the suggestion was, look, we just did this for the moderate density. Is this like a little thing we consider housekeeping? Maybe it should actually be a higher number, but we're not talking about that right now. We're just talking about putting it where it is for the moderate density. So that was something I would say kind of put in this housekeeping category. And the same thing with a suggestion to remove the reference to the number of stories from the maximum height, I guess. So the idea, right now we have the map that shows for a lot of downtown, the base maximum height is, let's say, 3 stories or 45 feet. And, there's supposed to be some correlation with how buildings are built so that they're kind of in the ballpark. But you just had this with the Dogwood Station where they needed a variance, I think it was a variance, right? Because their building, while it didn't exceed the maximum number of feet, it was 1 story too many. So at some point, the way some people can build a building, you start to have a little bit of conflict between the number of feet you could have and the number of stories you could have. And so a suggestion here was, would it make sense to remove the number of stories and just stick with the feet? And when you're getting a bonus, to say the bonus is for like 12 feet, like what would reasonably be in a story, I guess, something like that. So that's something that is, again, a suggestion. It wasn't discussed in the staff report. We can talk about it more at the next session. I guess I'm curious to see if there are any immediate reactions or heartburn about something like that. But
Great suggestion. Thank you for putting it in there, Brett.
Yeah, I agree with Chair Edge. I think it makes a lot of sense. A few instances come to mind where there was some conflict between stories and feet, and just it would be easier if we just settled on feet, because I think that's what people really care about, is how tall the thing is, not how many floors are on the inside. Do you agree, Commissioner Hamer?
I agree with that statement, but once again, it's an old man river. We run into this conflict with the residential thing, with the roof height and how high a building can be. We run into the same conflict with these stories. So I'm sure there was a reason why the story was in there and the foot height were in there. And I guess I would like a little bit more background on the logic of why that was written that way. If it's because Old Man River has always written it that way, then that's fine, right? But there's got to be some sort of logic to it. And I don't know what the logic is, because it seems to run into conflict everywhere. And so I guess I'm just looking for a little bit of background information.
Okay. See what we can find.
Yeah, I like the idea personally, but I do have a bit of a concern that I think a lot of people can think about 3 stories and what that building would look like. And when you tell them 42 feet, they can't. Mm-hmm. And so that would be my only caveat. I personally like it. I'm not sure that it translates well to just the way that people envision height.
Yeah,
That's a very good point, Commissioner Massey. Before joining the commission, I remember being an engaged community member fighting on an application, and was trying to figure out how tall was 35 feet. And I actually ended up coming across a telephone pole worker on the street one day, and I said, "How tall is that telephone pole?" And he said, "That one's 37 feet." And I was like, "All right." And so I think there is something useful there as reference.
Okay. Well, I think moving to the end here, I think just outlining where we were hoping to go with this project, because as we noted in the beginning, we've been at it for a long time and feel like we pulled together some material in a pretty sound way. Would really like to kind of wrap this up if we can by the end of the year. So what we were proposing to do is come back to you in a couple weeks. Obviously, we don't have all the commissioners here, and we'll try to get the other ones up to speed as well. Be interested to see if you have some questions, or we've noted a couple pieces of information and points. We'll see what we can figure out if we can, anything between now and August 23rd. Depending on how that discussion goes, we were hoping to get back to you on September 27th for a hearing to actually propose the amendments, where your role will be recommending approval or approval with revisions to the city council. We're planning on going to the city council in November for a couple of similar type of work sessions. And then depending on what we hear there and what happens with elections and all that kind of thing, ideally we'd like to try to see if we can get to the city council for an adoption hearing before the end of the year, their very last meeting of the year. So that's kind of what we're charting out in front of us. And I guess would like to see if you have some other thoughts or questions about things we could bring to the discussion on the 23rd.
Chair, if I may.
Yes, please.
So do we already have rules on art installation in the downtown mixed use? So are they required to install a piece of art?
No, I don't think
All
so.
right, so I have 3 things that I would like to add into the downtown mixed use. 1, art installation. So like Axle Tree, right? The screening that they did could be considered art, or their mural that they did could be considered art. I guess architecture is considered art, but they can go for a type 3 review for that.
You'd like to require some kind of public
Public art installation that can be seen by the public from the street, right? So you just can't stick it in the hallway. So it has to be.
Okay.
Another one is zero energy and carbon codes for buildings downtown, which means that, reducing their greenhouse gas emissions. And my last is requirement for charging stations. And I think the downtown.
For electric vehicles?
Electric vehicles, thank you. That the downtown mixed-use zone is, especially for those 3 things, is especially well-built as a part of maybe a project that we can take beyond.
Okay. I have a question and a note on a couple of these things. So I think their public art issue seems pretty clear. We can see we can
straightforward.
figure out about that and see kind of what we have already kind of in the mix or whatnot. The zero energy and carbon codes, I'd like a little clarification on that. Do you mean are you talking about like a building code kind of thing?
So you're designing the building to emit zero greenhouse gases. So you're either recycling it or reusing it, or you're using an alternative source of energy so that, whether it be natural gas or producing methane or carbon monoxide or whatever you want to say.
One potential way to think about it that I think is kind of the area that's being explored is kind of in setting building performance standards. So I think that would be kind of the place to maybe start exploring that. I know the city of Portland and other jurisdictions are looking at that.
There's 5 or 6 suggestions kind of on how to kind of look at this, if you just do a quick Google.
Yeah. You want
I was going to say, for the art installation, the zero energy, that's kind of like taking what we're doing and making it bigger, because that's going to require some substantial work.
No.
Just-
I hear you there. I just want to throw this out. And then charging stations. I would like to see at least 25% of the off-site parking area be required to have a charging station.
So on that note, we actually will be coming to the Planning Commission and the City Council between now and the end of the year with something about that. There actually are some new state rules that are in place that relate to requiring new buildings that are providing parking to provide a certain percentage, and we'll get into the details of capacity. And so I think we're limited, and this relates a little bit to building codes and what we can make people do that relate to the building codes, but we're not able to make people put in charging stations, but are able to make them put a certain percentage of spaces so that they have the capacity. So that they're planning ahead, they're putting in conduit, they're making sure their panel's big enough or that kind of thing, so that it's less expensive for them to install the stations when they want. But so that's kind of in the works for the whole city, like not just downtown.
And that's on the agenda for the 27th. It's House Bill 2180 that we can do some requirements above and beyond, but not much above and beyond what the building code allows us to. So we'll bring that to you so you can understand what we can do.
And I'd be happy to share with you, the city of Portland just went to public comment draft for their rules for implementing 2180. I think they're recommending 50% of all spots.
Tracking that, and it's in part of the presentation.
Yeah. And then I think I just sent it to you yesterday, Laura. I don't know if you've seen it, but the U.S. Access Board, which helps govern the American with Disabilities Act, actually just released guidance on electric vehicle charging parking spots. So there's some new information there that I think would be worthwhile to just review as you're thinking about those rules.
So one comment on the whole carbon footprint, and this is just a question, and I don't know the answer to, that's why I'm asking it, is that rather than for the city to go down some path of developing what can be complex standards for these kinds of things, would an alternate be that in the downtown area, they have to meet some minimal, LEED level, and maybe there's incentives for, the higher platinum LEED levels and all of that. Maybe there's some sort of graduation. I'm just saying that that's sort of a recognized standard. Would that achieve the same thing that Commissioner Heber has suggested?
I think it would. I just, we've talked a lot in the DLC meetings. I know I'm reaching back some years at this point because it's been a while since I've been at them, but when Brett will remember, we were, and probably Lauren would too, back in 2019, and before we were talking about, all kinds of different green building standards and trying to be kind of broad with it so that we can allow builders or developers to choose, from a menu of different standards, and these standards, and they are standards, and they define, thresholds for meeting the standards. So I think it does get us there without having to define things, in-house. I think that's a great proxy for, accomplishing some of those things. And, one of my favorites is the living building standard, and that covers a lot of the stuff that I think that would capture the stuff that Commissioner Emer was talking about pretty well. But obviously there's costs associated with meeting those standards. So I don't know how much we can require those in cases, but certainly I think that's a great proxy for defining something in-house.
Yeah, I would say too that the DLC did actually talk about green architecture and some of these ideas. That was for a while was an element on the list of the 14 that ended up kind of making it through. And I think there was a decision at some point that given the city's larger climate action plan and the size of that topic, I guess, that they decided to kind of wait for now and not try to develop a downtown specific design element related to green architecture. So for now, what the code has is this incentive, like there's a 1-story incentive for doing a LEED kind of building or something. That obviously, if I'm just happy to build a 3-story or less building and don't need any bonuses, then there's no incentive for that. So, we can talk about it a little bit more in between and see if there's any other response or just give a better explanation for that as well.
Well, so there's my list of my 3 pipe dreams that I would love to see. And if we could just at least get one, you can pick one on the list. If we at least get one, which seems pretty easy, love to see it.
All right.
Old Man River.
Point taken. Well, if there are no other questions, we'll regroup and come back to this group, hopefully with all the members here, and see what we can push through on. And if you have thoughts or questions in the meantime that come up about things you'd like us to address, if we can at that meeting, please let me know.
And I just want to thank, as a former member of the DLC for 7 years or so before I came on the Planning Commission, thank them for all of their hard work on this. I know how tedious and how long and how much thought goes into this. And so, Brett, will you please officially thank them for us?
Yeah, I'll let them know. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Brett. Okay, we're going to move on to the next item. And this work session item is a discussion of the definition of boarding house within the high density zone. Senior Planner Vera Collette and Associate Planner Adam Hara-Obel presents information about the boarding house definition for discussion. Please let me know if I mispronounced either of your last names.
Evening, everyone. Thanks very much. Vera Coleus here with Adam. Adam, if you don't mind sort of introducing the topic, I'm going to pull up the,
Yeah.
I have to find the PowerPoint. You can pull it
Yeah,
up. Thank
sounds
you.
good. I'm Adam Hiru, Associate Planner here at the City of Milwaukee. We are on our second session talking about the high density zones. And last session, we were able to come to some consensus around some new definitions for several different types of senior housing in the city. I know that not everyone was there, so there'll be an opportunity. I'll have that up on the screen in a second here as well. And then we have one more session scheduled on this topic as well coming up. Almost got it.
Yep.
PowerPoint up.
Right. I'm going to share my screen. Go.
All right. Okay, and I think we can go. Oh, can I actually do it or no? You?
No.
Okay, cool.
It's me.
So here we've got.
I just want to, do we need to take a break, Commissioner?
Oh, yeah.
Or stepped out for a second?
I could-
There it is.
I didn't want to get too deep into it.
You're right.
I have questions, so.
All right. As I showed sort of last work session that we had, here's the larger land use map for the city. And if we go one slide over, we can see these are the high density zones that are isolated. So you get a sense that they're really spread out all over the city, but there's a good cluster of them around downtown, and there's quite a few of them on the periphery and a few scattered in the middle there. Go to the next slide. So this is kind of our proposed review schedule. Where we are today is in the yellow. We're coming back on August 23rd to talk about the different uses, the sort of review process behind those, and then talk about potentially consolidating those zones down to fewer zones. And then there's some dates, hopefully by the end of this year, for going to city council and kind of wrapping up some of these code changes. Here you can see that we've got the definitions that are proposed, and these are detailed in the memo from the last meeting, but I put them up here just to kind of refresh everybody's memory from what happened at that previous work session. So the key kind of takeaway is that we consolidated a lot of these down into two different use types, and it's really just dependent upon the size of the facility. So if it's an adult foster care home, that just means that it serves up to 5 people, and it's permitted by right in all the residential zones. And then we took several other types of we are now hoping to call residential care facilities, so different types of senior housing. We kind of redefined them according to some of the state definitions and grouped them in this way. So that's kind of just a refresher in case some of the folks who missed hadn't seen this yet. So what are boarding houses? So this is, according to the city of Milwaukie, this is what a boarding house is. It's a building or portion thereof without separate housekeeping facilities to be occupied, or which is occupied primarily by persons paying consideration for sleeping purposes, where meals may or may not be provided, and which is not occupied as a single dwelling unit. And lodging capacity is subject to the provisions of the Uniform Building Code. So that's kind of what we have in the code today, and we're proposing some reimagining of this and some new definition for this as well.
If I might just jump in for a second, we currently don't have any boarding houses in the city that we could find. They've been permitted in our code since really essentially our first code in 1946. And there may have been some in the past at that point, but currently we don't have any operating boarding houses.
Yeah, and they're a conditional use currently in all of the, a lot of the residential zones that they're allowed. So here we have a little bit of history we're going to walk through around what is a boarding house and sort of there's a lot of different housing types that are really similar to boarding houses that have existed throughout history. So the term really emerged in the mid-1800s to describe low-cost residential hotels, boarding houses, as we have it defined, rooming houses, lodging houses, and the renting out of rooms in private apartments. A lot of people have done that sort of throughout history. A lot of cities depended on this kind of housing. Shared kitchen and eating facilities in these spaces usually. Sometimes the bathrooms are shared. Sometimes there's your own bathroom situation. The units are separated, so there's usually a locked door for each unit, and they often include other services. And here you can see a boarding house, I think from 1941, which has some Alabama munitions plant workers eating dinner at their boarding house together, I assume after work. Go to the next. So this type of housing, single room occupancy, whether it's a boarding house or some of these other terms, have really been the bedrock of affordable housing, especially for workers in American cities since the mid-1800s. Upscale SROs, though, also provided housing for people of middle and higher incomes Edgar Allan Poe lived in an SRO, for instance, for a while. So there's just a lot of different types of people who historically have lived in this kind of housing. And also, it's important to note that as affordable single-family homes became a thing in the suburbs in America, it really shifted the demographics and the income levels of who is living in these SROs, especially in urban centers. And so you have here an 1860s boarding house in New York City in this picture. You can see there's a lot of, it's very lively. There's a ton of people out spending time together. It's a very high contact form of housing. And we can go to the next slide. So as the demand for single family homes went up and the sort of decreased demand of this SRO housing, it became really at the bottom of the market, and it remains there today in terms of affordability. There's also a lot of concerns with this kind of housing, especially through just the stigmatization of poverty and single person households, folks with disabilities and folks with mental illness, and also recognizing that a lot of these SROs have historically had a lot of problems, especially because of their inadequate services, the housing of a lot of people with, say, mental illness or disabilities in close proximity without those services, and also a lack of privacy, a lack of design elements to ensure livable space, and really led to chaotic, high contact living for a lot of people, which is not often the best situation for someone who's, at the lower end of income and who's dealing with some of these other issues, especially, disability and mental illness. So a lot of cities saw that SROs were creating a lot of issues, and so they banned them in their cities completely. And the US since 1970 has lost about 2 million or more SROs units, which often means that people are becoming houseless, as a result in many of those cases. And here you've got a SRO that was a Jackson House in Tampa, Florida, that it closed in 1989, and recently they started turning it into a museum with some of the history of how it functioned and how people staying there, contributed to the city and whatnot. So we can go to the next. So in recent years, there's been a little bit of a increase in interest in SROs. There have been efforts to preserve existing SROs in the city of Portland and elsewhere, places where there are SROs. Portland has also developed through some of the new housing money that's come through, has developed some new SROs with Central City Concern that improve upon some of the historical issues with SROs. And then the cities like Seattle are developing some market rate SROs that are more akin to adult dorm living, where there's services also, but it's like social services, gathering people together for birthday parties and helping people coordinate meal hangouts and whatnot. And then to also add new SROs. Sometimes they are not a newly built building, they're just a motel that someone kind of converts to a more of a long-term stay situation. And we can go to the next slide. So these are just a few examples of some of the existing SROs. The one at the top here and the one on the bottom left were both developed by Central City Concern, which serves a lot of the populations who are, on the edge of houselessness or struggling with that, and also struggling with addiction or mental illness. So we've got Findlay Commons and Cedar Commons in this picture here. And on the bottom right, we've got the Broadway Hotel, which is in downtown Portland, I believe, and has been in operation for a really long time as well. So just some examples that they kind of look a lot like apartments look for the most part. So here we have our proposed sort of revised definition for what a boarding house is now. And we propose retiring the term boarding house and avoiding the use of the term single room occupancy or SRO, because there is a lot of stigma attached to that terminology, and Micro unit is a term that has come out of some of recent developments in Seattle, for instance. They're starting to use this term micro unit as well. And it ultimately describes the unit in the development rather than, the residents inside, which I think boarding house still has that connotation. So I want to, I guess maybe we have a question coming up here, but if there's any immediate reactions, feel free to jump in with your questions or thoughts as since we're kind of just putting this out here now.
Chair, if I may.
Yes, please.
Can you, with this code right here, can you explain the difference between a single-family dwelling renting 2 bedrooms and a micro-unit development?
The difference between a single family home renting 2 bedrooms. Familiar portion. And I think that gets to the piece that I had up earlier, the earlier slide that was talking about many different types of historical SROs. A lot of cities and states have banned renting by room, for instance. So it is kind of within that same, but ultimately renting by room within your house, if you're sharing, if you don't have like the locked rooms and stuff, that I've heard it often, if the units aren't fully separated, that is actually, I think, a difference here, or a difference in sort of how they're often defined. But that is something that has definitely come up in our discussions, or something that's been on the kind of the periphery a little bit.
Yeah, my number one concern is that we are creating a rule, or we're redefining a rule that may or may not actually need to be written, and that it affects maybe a whole bunch of other different things by the way that we write it. So if I look at this, and if inside my house I'm renting out 2 rooms to a roommate, right? Mm-hmm. And I own the building, it seems like to me all of a sudden now I'm a micro unit development. And depending on what you do on the backside of it, right? Mm-hmm. The extra concerns or rules that you put in onto a micro unit development, it may affect those other things.
So one thing that's a key difference that isn't quite shown here is that we are saying in our code as we develop it, at least currently proposed, that a micro unit is considered multi-unit. So that's kind of the key connector. It doesn't say it here exactly. So that's definitely a.
May I suggest that you put a multi-unit building, mm-hmm, or portion of building in the definition, so that is clear, mm-hmm, to that.
Yep. Good point.
Yeah, that's a reasonable clarification. Thank you, Commissioner.
We will do that. All right, any other thoughts on this as we've got it up, and of course there's always time for more.
I have one question. I don't know if you discovered this in the research, but basically from what you've shown, it seems to be that these micro unit developments, some of which, look very nice from the exterior, they seem to be developed, I'm assuming through nonprofit, government grants, whatever. Is there any market for, just commercial development of units like this? Is there? I don't know.
So they have been getting developed in Seattle with some success. If the news articles I've read, are any indication of what the developers are saying about them, they're, especially because they're providing this social sort of services involved with it as well. Mm-hmm. It becomes really appealing to people who feel disconnected in the city. So there are places where these sort of market rate developments are occurring. They're not happening in Portland as far as we know at this point in the Portland region, but there are, there's examples in Seattle, New York, and other large cities where this is happening.
They're so much more affordable. They're just cheaper. They're less
absolutely.
expensive.
Yeah. It's sort of like an upscale dorm room. I don't know.
Yeah. There were a series of articles, if I may, through the chair, in the New York Times ran that that's exactly what they were. They were for, young adults coming out of college, can't afford a real apartment, but really love the idea of living with a lot of other people. Big shared kitchen, lounge area. I mean, it's a dorm kind of situation for young adults that have jobs and all of that. And it's a more affordable thing. So, and it sounds like, Seattle has been developing at market rate kinds of things. We don't know of any here yet, but it's just another kind of multi-unit development. They just don't each have their own kitchen. They might have a hot plate and a microwave or something, but at least if the New York Times is to be believed, young adults don't cook, so they don't need their own kitchen, evidently.
Well, I think the term boarding house is outdated and everything like that, but just, without this discussion and background, if someone came up to me and asked me what a micro unit development was, I would say, I don't have a clue. Just that term doesn't mean a lot to me. I don't know. It's kind of like the color orange. I just don't like it.
Well, it's a newer term, and we had a lot of discussions about what the right term was, because we did all this research and looked at other jurisdictions, and the thing that we felt even though this isn't a familiar term, it may likely become a more familiar term. This was just kind of a way to remove any of the stigma around. I
understand the focus.
This is the best one we came up with. If y'all come up with something better,
have a contest.
Sure. I actually like SRO. I don't find anything the matter with that, but Old Man River over here.
That's right.
It comes with a lot of baggage, that sort of thing, for folks. And I think, and micro unit was intended to just describe the unit. They're small and kind of leave it at that. But if folks come up with a better term, happy to entertain it.
I guess one of the clarifying questions that I had in reading the definition is how you see the last sentence kind of playing out. Because I think the front part, the physical character of the development, I think, is very clear. And then you get to this use intent kind of component. And what would happen if, say, the micro unit development is for a 1 week stay or a 2 week stay or a 3 week stay?
That gets into, at least like the way we've proposed it, is essentially a hotel. So it would be a commercial use, a commercial hotel, commercial lodging. So that's the distinction, and that's a distinction that I believe Portland makes as well in their code for what constitutes in their language group living. It becomes a hotel or a commercial purpose when it gets less than a month or longer.
What if would it be a short-term rental then also, if it wasn't a hotel? Somebody Airbnb it out for 3 week stays, 4 week stays?
Folks could do, certainly, if I live in an apartment building and I decide to short-term rental my unit, there are other probably rules from the management company about doing that, but it's not designed it's designed as a residential use, so it's intended to be, otherwise it, as Adam said, it would be commercial lodging. Because in our sort of thought about redefining the boarding house into this kind of, new term and sort of, updated definition, is that this is a kind of multi-unit development. So this multi-unit development could be downtown, because we allow multi-family development downtown, but also in the high-density residential zone. So there's intended to be a distinction between commercial lodging and hotels, that it's intended to be, this is where folks live. Semi-permanently.
And I think she got it right. And Vera, she said that I think that there would be other issues from the management where you wouldn't be able to lease these out as Airbnbs, because you could do that if it was a condo, right? Because you have the right to do that at your own property. But if it's an apartment building, I would imagine.
And you have to, for 270 days, occupy for a short-term rental, and that would be very difficult in a 10 by 10 room or however small that's probably exaggeration for how small they might be, but they often are quite small. So you would sort of have a limit on how much you could do that.
Great, thanks.
So I have one more that to help me clarify this a little bit. Do we in our code have something for halfway houses or rehabilitation housing?
We have, is it called a transitional
Yeah, they're called
facility?
Transitional housing, fine, whatever we want to call it.
Yep.
Isn't this what a micro unit development is transitional housing?
Not necessarily, no.
No,
Why?
because it could be market rate.
Yeah, but so is transitional housing.
And in this case, it's not a,
You're paying a fee to live there, and that's market rate based on whoever owns the property.
Well, you could say the same would be true of apartment buildings. They're kind of transitional. Like you can live there for 6 months or 8, 9 months or.
I hear you.
Yeah.
But we define that totally different in our code. That's why I'm trying to get beyond this micro unit development, and I think about a halfway house or transitional housing.
Well,
Where
let me give you an example. Northwest Housing, up here on the other side of the high school, is transitional housing. And it is much more like an apartment.
Right, but that's an apartment because they have their own refrigerator, their own stove, their own that. So that makes that.
But that's
not a
transitional housing, though.
No, but that's not a micro unit development.
I agree.
A halfway house or a rehabilitation center is generally kind of set up more like a dorm facility, right? Where they give you a room, a microwave, and probably a hot plate, and then, meals down below. And, there are certain regulatory rules that you have to be able to stay there. And so I'm just wondering if they're treated different in the code, or would this be considered a micro unit development?
And maybe just adding on that, like I think adult care facility on one of the first slides, most of those places don't have a kitchen or,
Right, in their
again, it's
own
a lot of
individual
kind of those
room,
shared
yeah.
facilities.
And that's, and
I mean, this could simply be an efficiency apartment complex or an efficiency apartment building, with just small units that have, not a full range, to cook on, but, a hot plate or, something, or a microwave, these could absolutely be, market rate, kind of higher priced, luxury city units, for people if they wanted a small in-town unit. I guess my question is, when we're talking about micro units, we're talking about this new term and, and everything, and we're trying to capture, this thing that doesn't happen in Portland. I guess my question is how does this not define the eco house micro unit apartment building that was built at Northwest Petty Grove and 14th in 2012? How is that not a micro unit development and by this definition? And how does that not exist in our inventory of things that are happening in the Portland region that are micro units more than 10 years old? So, I'm guessing you excluded it from the definition somehow, but that it bills itself as a micro unit apartment complex. It meets all of this criteria with 200 square foot, 400 square foot apartments that may or may not have cooktops. How is that not captured by this definition?
Chair Edge, if I may, it's funny, I had that same thought because I remember this micro unit development coming online years and years ago, and then I just kind of put it aside, but we can just look into it because I do think that development is a micro unit development. We just maybe haven't captured it in our research, that's all. So I think it probably is, confirm that for you.
and I think.
Yeah, there's several eco house branded developments throughout the city of Portland. So I'm just curious if those are or are not micro units per our definition, because that's what they bill themselves as. And honestly, I see it as congruent, and that this is a good definition for that as long as it includes the things that are in the market today in Portland that call themselves micro units. Totally on board with this definition. I just want to make sure that we're not using this definition to define something that exists that does not meet this definition. But it sounds like it probably does.
And I think part of it has to do with how we got to that. We started with boarding houses because it's in the high density zone use table. And then we kind of followed that through, like there are no boarding houses. And I think, I don't know much about this particular development from 2012, so I'll be sure to dig in later this week. But I think when we look at that sort of trajectory, I can see how we missed it. And I also think one of the key, we'll be digging more into some of the questions about consolidating different things. And maybe some of these terms aren't that different than each other. So maybe that might require, more action from the commission or more suggestions about how to resolve some of these tensions with, how is it different than a residential care facility, or how is it different from a multi-unit? So it's a point well taken for sure.
If I could jump in, we will double check and compare how we describe transitional housing. It's defined in the code. It's a community service use, in the code. So we'll make sure that we're not in conflict with that, or make sure that they're distinct, that they're intended to be distinct or not. We'll double check it. No, you raise a good point. And if I could, to Commissioner Sherman, how are they different from adult foster care homes? Are specifically defined by the state, and so it's a single. Generally, they're in our. It's a single family home that operates as a single housekeeping unit for the purpose of providing licensed nursing care and that sort of thing. So the definition is pretty specific, but you raise a good point. I mean, some of these things, they kind of cross, they describe multiple things. So we want to make sure that we're being really clear about what we're doing. And Chair Edge, thank you for bringing up the eco house development. I'm interested to see, I'm not familiar with it at all. So thank you for raising it, and we'll just make sure that we're not precluding that or defining something that, that something like that couldn't be built. Thank you for that.
Yeah, I think the key thing that I'm stuck on is the terminology. And since we were very clearly trying to say, hey, here's this term to capture things that don't exist in the regional market today. And I can think of an example that does fit, but I wanted to make sure that that we either overlooked that, which is fine. It happens. There's a lot of buildings built in Portland in the last 10 years. It's okay. I just want to make sure that if we're choosing a term, that we're not choosing a term that means something completely different that is not captured by our definition out in the market today. You know what I mean? We don't want confusing terminology in our definitions. And so I'm really just, if we can confirm that what I'm familiar with as being a micro unit in the marketplace today in Portland is consistent with our definition of micro unit, then I think it makes perfect sense to adopt that term. And that's all I'm trying to be clear about, is that we're not using terminology that doesn't meet what other people might think it does based on what's out on the market today. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
It does to me.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah.
Yes.
And I also want staff to go back and think, do we actually really need to define that? Is there a reason why they can't exist in the code today without actually a definition? So I'm fine with just scratching out boarding house. And if it's, I guess, if you need a 220 plug to make it a living space, right? If that's the rule, well, then probably you need to write a rule for that, right? Because you wouldn't have that in one of those micro units. But if that's not the requirement, then, is there actually a reason to even write it into code and try to box it in? I mean, like I said, I don't know where the conflict comes in with the code, if you have it or if you don't have it. I understand the purpose of it. It's not that I'm against the purpose. It's just, you understand what I mean by that?
Yeah, and currently boarding houses are, and this gets into the review piece, but they're currently a conditional use in a lot of the zones that they're allowed in. And so if you remove you're sort of removing that, I guess, if you scratch it out of the code.
Right, but we, I think that we all sat here and said, well, they don't really actually exist anymore. A true definition of a boarding house. And so if you scratch out boarding house and you don't have any particular rule that defines what a living space is, that would ban a micro unit development itself, then why write it into the code? I guess is kind of my question.
So if I could, what I'm hearing is do we need to have it as a separate thing? Is it implied that it just is a type of multi-unit development without us having to actually say that it is?
Right.
I see what you're saying. Oh.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like with the language, where rooms do not constitute separate dwellings is trying to capture something, that, is different from just a multifamily development or a multi-unit development. But ultimately, I think, this really just feels like a multi-unit development to me. And so I guess, would we be counting units differently for the density standard?
Or your parking
Exactly.
or whatever it is, right? Because, you could get a bunch more rooms into there without probably a lot of more impact to the surrounding environment.
And Eugene has a standard in their code where I think 4 SRO rooms equal 1 unit. And so there are examples of other jurisdictions that try to define the density piece a little bit differently also.
Right, so maybe that's the reason why this definition needs to exist, but I certainly would like to have you guys think a little bit more. I know all the work that you've put together, and I certainly do appreciate it. I'm not trying to, but I want to make sure that we're putting something into the code that needs to be put in the code, and what's the viable reason, right, for it. And if it's because we need to create different densities or different outside environmental impacts that go into those kind of things, parking and, charging stations and the amount of public art or whatever we put together in a multifamily, right? Do we need to write different code for things?
Okay.
Different standards. Standards is the right
10 pieces of public art.
word. Right. Yeah.
Right?
Pay a lot more occupancy. Each person can pony up more dollars.
All right, more to chew on. We've been chewing on it. We'll keep chewing on it. It's
Yeah.
Absolutely.
been a really good, interesting
No,
exercise
it's
to go
a
through.
really fascinating,
It really-
when you start to think about it, it's very fascinating.
There's
Complicated.
another developer in Portland, you could try and look at some of his work, Kevin Kavanaugh.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Built some cool stuff.
Chair, if I may.
No, not yet.
I'm not. Hold on, you hold on, okay? I just want to salute the planning staff on this because you probably broke the track changes function on your computers doing this. And I know how hard these can be because I've been involved in some of these things, is trying to rationalize these conflicting, overlapped, gapped things. And I know it's not easy, and I appreciate all the work that you've done on this, and along with some help from the DLC and others. So it's probably not fun work.
It's interesting,
It's
though.
needed work.
If you could go through all of the conflicts and just come up with the answers, then not figure out how it all works technically, that would be really fun. But we don't get to do that. So
Yeah, that's a point against algorithms. Really.
Well, wait till the next work session because we
Oh,
glue
goodness.
everything together.
Yeah.
You'll actually see the underlined strike out of the code. We try to consolidate some stuff that,
Well, just reading this gave me a headache,
Oh,
and I'm not sure it got much better.
well, yeah. Buy some Tylenol for the next one. Yeah.
So we're down to a couple more slides. This one's just showing you the terms that exist now on the left, and then kind of what the proposed new definition is and what the new use types would all be. And so it's just a little refresher, including the maybe it's micro unit term as well.
So,
And then this is the question we've been digging into so far. So, does the commission support retiring the boarding house term? Sounds like there's maybe some different opinions there, and then also whether you support replacing it with micro unit. It seems like there's interest in more information, but I'm curious if there are other points that folks want to make or thoughts you have about this.
Or should we just proceed? And you can tell us what you think.
Yeah, once we dig into some more stuff.
If I can, because I've been working on sort of the land use review process for all of these guys and trying to reconcile them with the consolidation of the zones. Is it fair to say that there's general support for considering a micro-unit development the same as a multi-unit development, so they can kind of, they're same as far as the land use type? Okay, great. I just wanted to make sure that we're on board with that. That helps streamline that line in the code. Thank you.
I would say yes, please to that, Vera. Yes,
Right.
please.
Thank you. Good. Trying to simplify if we can.
And if there aren't any more questions, then we could just move on to the next, if the chair edge is good with that.
Okay, I guess we're good. No other questions about the presentation? Okay. Then we are on to other business. Do staff or commissioners have any other items for discussion?
Chair, if I may. This is
Yes, please.
Laura's favorite part. Milwaukie Museum, Two Sisters Play Cafe, Clackamas County Cultural Coalition, and Milwaukie Lumber, along with Professional Fools Productions, are proud to present performance at the museum August 13th with Spencer Sprocket performing 2 shows at 1:30 and 3:30 p.m. They'll be on the back lawn of the Milwaukie Museum located at 3737 Southeast Adams Street. Please bring a blanket or lawn chairs. Admission is free, but please feel free to tip the performer. And after that wonderful event, head on down to the duck races and the concert at Milwaukie Bay Park on August 13th, starting at 6 p.m. If you've never seen the duck races, you can always guarantee that somebody is going to be saving a duck by splashing in the Willamette, so it's always a good time. So come on down. That's all I have.
Thank you, Commissioner Heeman. Any other updates?
Yes, I have an item. Let's see.
Yeah, go for it.
So we did the interviews for a new planning commissioner, and there should be an appointment of a new planning commissioner at the city council meeting next week. So by August 23rd, our next meeting together, that person should be with us as a planning commissioner. So that's super exciting, and we'll be sure that they are briefed up on everything that we'll be discussing. And so that rolls right into the future forecast. If I can go ahead and do that, Chair Edge, unless anybody else has anything to add.
Yeah, go for it.
Future forecast. So again, August 23rd, we're going to talk about these same things that we talked about tonight. We're going to talk about them again. And then we have got 2 hearing items. We've got a variance request, and then very exciting, we have the 3rd phase of Milwaukie Bay Park, which is really exciting. And then on September 13th, we've got 1 hearing item. Again, it's a variance, and then the work session item on the code amendments for the climate-friendly, equitable communities, which is that stuff that's coming out of the state that will have some impact on our parking and some other things. So we will give you an overview of what that rulemaking kind of involves and how it might impact the city.
One quick question on that agenda item.
Yeah.
Is that the North Clackamas Parks District giving that presentation? Who's giving that on the Milwaukie Bay Park?
Yes, the NCPRD is the applicant.
So they're
for
the applicant
Yes,
developer.
correct.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay. Thanks for the forecast, Laura. I will now entertain a motion to adjourn.
I move to adjourn.
I'll second the motion.
A motion and a second. All those in favor, raise your hand and say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Passed unanimously. Thank you very much. Have a great night, everybody. See you in 2 weeks.
Everyone.
Thanks, everyone.